They came to General Secretary Gorbachev, and they told him there was a woman in the Kremlin. She wouldn't leave unless she could see him. So he said, well, bring her in. And they brought her in. And he said, old mother, what is it? What? She said, I have a question. He said, all right. She said, was communism invented by a politician or a scientist? Well, he said, a politician. She said, that explains it. The scientist would have tried it on mice first. There was a fellow that was on his way to a mountain resort, and a policeman stopped him and said, did you know that you're driving without taillights? And the driver hopped out of the car. He was so badly shaken that the officer took pity on him and said, well, now, wait a minute, calm down. It's not that serious an infraction. The fellow said, it may not mean much to you, but to me it means I've lost my trailer, a wife, and 4 kids. By its very existence and character, Berlin remains the most compelling argument for an open world. We're reminded of the many traditions of openness and democracy that have marked the history of this city. America missed me. It's a story about the parent with the 2 children and 2 sons, and one of them was a dyed-in-the-wool pessimist, and the other one was an incurable optimist. And they thought they were both so unrealistic that they talked to a psychiatrist about it, and he said he thought he could solve the problem. And they said, well, what? Well, he said, let's get the most magnificent set of toys any boy ever had, and we'll put him in a room. We'll take the pessimist there, and then we'll turn him loose, and when he sees those toys and knows they're all for him, he'll get over being a pessimist. And he said, what are you going to do about the optimist? Well, he said, I have a friend who's got a racing stable, and he said we can get quite a quantity of what they clean out of the stable, and we'll put that in another room, and when the optimist has seen his brother get those toys, and then he gets that, he'll get over being an optimist. Well, they did it. Finally, after a period, they then went in and followed in where the boy was with the toys, and he was sitting there crying, and they said, what are you crying about? He said, well, I know somebody's going to come and take these away from me. And they went down to the room with the optimist, and he was on that top of that pile of stuff, and he was throwing it over his shoulder as fast as he could, and they said, what are you doing? He says, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. There are almost as many of you as there are Democratic presidential candidates. And don't you get a little nervous when those born-again budget balancers tell us there's only one way to reduce deficits, and it begins with raising your taxes? They'll cut what America needs to protect her national security. Oh, they say they're for a strong national defense, but ask them if we should build the B-1 bomber, or the MX missile, or the Trident submarine, or the cruise missile, or the aircraft carriers, or the M1 tank, or rebuild the battleship Iowa. Well, that's another story. I don't know how they feel about slingshots. This was a Democratic fundraising rally at a hotel. And outside, when all of them were coming out, there was a kid there with a bunch of puppies, and he was trying to sell them, and he was saying, come, buy a Democrat puppy, buy a Democrat puppy. 2 weeks later, the Republicans held a fundraiser in the same hall. And there was the same kid with the same puppies. When they were coming out, he was saying, buy a Republican puppy. Well, one of the press, a newspaper man who'd seen him 2 weeks before, said, hey, kid, wait a minute. 2 weeks ago, you were trying to sell these puppies as Democrats. What are you doing here now trying to sell them as Republicans? The kid says, now they got their eyes open. Have you ever noticed you're in a profession where when you're introduced sometimes at a social gathering to someone you've never met before, and the first thing you know, when they hear that word doctor, they start right out by saying, well, doctor, I've been having a, and they go on with that. Well, we had a fellow in the business I used to be in show business, Moss Hart, the playwright, and he was an inveterate along that line. Anytime he was introduced to a doctor, he had a complaint. And one night at a party in Hollywood, he was introduced to a Dr. Jones and immediately started talking about this low back pain that he was having. And the fellow that introduced him was embarrassed, and he said, Moss, Dr. Jones is a doctor of economics. That didn't stop Moss. He turned right back to the doctor and said, I bought some stock last week. Remember the story of the fellow here a while ago who was running for Congress as a Republican,
He stopped by a farm to do some campaigning, and when the farmer heard he was a Republican, his jaw dropped and he said, "Wait right here." He said, "While I get Ma. She's never seen a Republican before." So he got Ma, and the candidate looked around for a podium to give his speech from. The only thing he could find was a pile of that stuff that Bess Truman took 35 years trying to get Harry to call fertilizer. So he got up on the mound, and when they came back, he gave his speech. End of it, the farmer says, "That's the first time I've ever heard a Republican speech." The candidate said, "That's the first time I've ever given a Republican speech from a Democratic platform."
There's a fellow whose job sitting in one of our big busy agencies here is to have papers arrive at his desk, memorandums and so forth, look at them, figure out where they're supposed to go, initial them and send them on their way. One day, a paper arrived that was classified, but it had come to his desk, so he read it, he initialed it and sent it on to where he figured it should go. It arrived back at his desk the next day with a memo that said, "You weren't supposed to read this. Erase your initials and initial the erasure." I tell you, I feel a little bit here like the man who was the farmer that was driving his horse and wagon to town for a load of grain and had a head-on collision with an automobile.
Did you hear the story about the kid who was outside the Democratic fundraiser selling kittens? When the people came out from the fundraiser, he was holding up the kittens and he was saying, "Buy a Democrat kitten." Well, a couple of weeks later, the Republicans held a fundraiser in the same place. And when they came out, there was the same kid with the kittens. And he said, "Buy a Republican kitten." And one of the members of the press who'd seen him there 2 weeks before said, "Wait a minute, kid. You were selling these kittens the last time as Democrat kittens. How come the Republican kittens now?" Kid says, "Because now they got their eyes open."
Story about a woman who walked into a bridal shop one day, told the sales clerk that she was looking for a wedding gown for her 4th wedding. Well, the saleswoman asked, "Just exactly what type of dress are you looking for?" "A long, flowing white dress with a veil," she responded with assurance. Not totally convinced, but afraid to offend the woman, the sales lady said, "You know, dresses of that nature are usually more appropriate for brides who are being married for the first time, for those a bit more innocent, if you know what I mean." Well, the lady retorted and put her hand on her hip. "I do know what you mean, and I can assure you I'm as innocent as the rest of them. Despite all my marriages, I remain as innocent as any first-time bride." Well, you see, my first husband was a dear, sweet man. It was a terrible tragedy, actually. All the excitement of the wedding was simply too much for him, and he died as we checked into the hotel on our wedding night. "I'm sorry to hear that," said the clerk, "but what about the others?" "Well, my second husband and I got into a terrible fight in the limousine on the way to our wedding reception. We haven't spoken since and got the marriage quickly annulled." "What about your third husband?" asked the store clerk. "Well," the woman replied, "he was a Democrat. And every night for 4 years, he just sat on the edge of the bed and told me how good it was going to be." Sorry, I know that some of you are no beginners when it comes to writing headlines. Reminds me a little bit of a cub reporter. You knew that something would remind me of a story. A cub reporter whose first solo assignment was interviewing a fellow who was just going to have a birthday that made him the oldest person in town. And he got to the address. It was an older building out in the outskirts of the city, and an elderly gentleman ushered him in. He sat down, and the reporter determined he was the man, and he said he was there for the interview, and he led right to the matter about how old are you, and the man said 96. He said, "To what do you attribute your longevity?" And the fellow said, "I don't smoke, drink, or run around with wild women." And at that moment there was a crash from upstairs, and the reporter looked up and he said, "What was that?" The old boy said, "Oh, that's Dad, he's drunk again." There's a story, you knew I'd have one of these, about a fella who always wanted to work with animals. And he applied at the zoo. And they had an ad out, they needed someone there. And then he found out to his dismay that the job they had immediately open was dressing in a gorilla outfit, taking the place of the gorilla who just died until a new one could be delivered. And then they promised that he'd have a regular job at the zoo once that took place. Well, he put on the suit and he got in the cage. He got a little bored sitting around, so particularly when the children were there, he began doing tricks and showing off for them. And finally he got so interested in that, he got carried away one day. He was swinging on a rope and he swung so far that he landed in the lion's cage that was next door. And the lion came roaring at him. And he started screaming for help. "Somebody get me out of here, get me out of here." And the lion jumped on him and says, "Shut up or you'll get us both fired." Asked their sons for some money. And the first son was a lawyer, and he said, "No, I can't do it. I'm just fitting out a new law office and sending my son to an expensive camp." So they asked their second son, a doctor, but he said, "No, I'm sorry, I can't. I just bought a new house and my wife is putting in a new kitchen." Then they asked the third son, who was an engineer, and he replied, "It just would be impossible for me to do it. I have just bought a big boat for the family and I'm remodeling our summer home on the lake." And finally the father pleaded, "Look, we've worked all our lives, not one day of vacation. We never had any money except what we saved for your education. In fact, do you realize that your mother and I were so busy working, trying to save money, that we never took the time out to get a marriage license?" And "Father," said all the three sons in unison, "do you realize what that makes us?" He said, "Yes, and cheap ones too." Honor and a pleasure for me to be here with you, sharing the spirit and the festivities of St. Patrick's Day. The blessed St. Patrick, we are told, died on this day in the year of our Lord, 461. And leave it to the Irish to be carrying on a wake for 1,500 years. You know, there's a 10-year delay in the Soviet Union of delivery of an automobile. And only 1 out of 7 families in the Soviet Union to a fellow, and this is their story that they tell, this joke, that this man, he laid down his money, and then the fellow that was in charge said to him, "Okay, come back in 10 years and get your car." And he said, "Morning or afternoon?" And the fellow behind the counter said, "Well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make?" And he said, "Well, the plumber's coming in the morning." I didn't tell this one to Gorbachev. It seems that they recently issued an order that anyone that's caught speeding must get a ticket. So it seems that one morning Gorbachev himself came out of his country home, knew he was late getting to the Kremlin, told his driver to get in the back seat and he'd drive. And down the road he went, past 2 motorcycle policemen. One of them took out after him. In a few minutes he's back with his buddy. And the buddy says, "Did you give him a ticket?" He said, "No." Well, he said, "Why not? We were told that anyone caught speeding was to get a ticket." He says, No, this one was too important." Well, he said, "Who was it?" He says, "I don't know. I couldn't recognize him, but his driver was Gorbachev." This was a Democratic fundraising rally at a hotel. And outside, when all of them were coming out, there was a kid there with a bunch of puppies, and he was trying to sell them, and he was saying, "Come, buy a Democrat puppy, buy a Democrat puppy." 2 weeks later, the Republicans held a fundraiser in the same hall. And there was the same kid with the same puppies. When they were coming out, he was saying, "Buy a Republican puppy." Well, one of the press, a newspaper man who'd seen him 2 weeks before, said, "Hey, kid, wait a minute. 2 weeks ago, you were trying to sell these puppies as Democrats. What are you doing here now trying to sell them as Republicans?" The kid says, "Now they got their eyes open." You know, back in the days of vaudeville, vaudevillians trying to get bookings, and even young ones trying to break into the show business, they'd go into an empty theater, and there'd be an agent sitting out there in about the 3rd row, all alone in the theater. cigar in his mouth, wearing a check suit, and the vaudevillian would have to show his wares to this cynic. One day a young fella came in, the agent was sitting out there, and this young fella wanted to break into show business, walked down to the stage. The agent said, "All right, kid, what do you do?" And the kid never answered. He just took off and flew around the ceiling of the theater, made a couple of circles right up there at the top, and then zoomed down and stopped right in front of the agent. The agent took the cigar out of his mouth and says, "What else do you do besides bird imitations?" An evangelical minister and a politician arrived at Heaven's Gate one day together. And St. Peter, after doing all the necessary formalities, took them in hand to show them where their quarters would be. And he took them to a small single room with a bed, a chair, and a table, and said this was for the clergyman. And the politician was a little worried about what might be in store for him. And he couldn't believe it then when St. Peter stopped in front of a beautiful mansion with lovely grounds, many servants, and told him that these would be his quarters. And he couldn't help but ask. He said, "But wait, there's something wrong. How do I get this mansion while that good and holy man only gets a single room?" And St. Peter said, "You have to understand how things are up here. We got thousands and thousands of clergy. You're the first politician who ever made it." Out driving on a back road on his way to look at some property, and suddenly noticed down beside him was a chicken keeping pace with him, and he was doing 60 miles an hour. And suddenly the chicken spurted out ahead of him, and it looked to him as if the chicken had 3 legs. And then it turned and went down a sign road and into a barnyard, and the driver turned down that lane, drove into the barnyard. There was a farmer there, and he asked him, he said, "Did you see a chicken go by here?" And the farmer said, "Yep." He says, "Did they have 3 legs?" And the farmer says, "Yep. I raise them that way. I breed them." He says, "You do?" He said, how come?" "Well," he said, "I just love the drumstick, and Ma always liked the drumstick, and now Junior's come along, and he likes it, and we just got tired of fighting over it. So I've been breeding 3-legged chickens." And the driver said, "Well, how do they taste?" He says, "I don't know. I haven't been able to catch one yet."
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.